I was sitting in the small parlor of my cousin Neka's house, staring at her trembling hands as she held the police report. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. It was as if her voice had been stolen by the weight of what she'd just learned. "It was the housemaid," she finally whispered. "Mary. The sweet girl Neka hired 6 months ago, Neka already 3 months pregnant at the time. Neka and Chuka had 2 young children, aged 5 and 3, and she had only taken in Mary to help out during her pregnancy. But what she discovered later turned her world upside down. She came to them through an agent recommended for her humble nature and hardworking spirit. I had met her once, a quiet girl. When Mary arrived, it was clear she was different from the other maids Neka had hired in the past. She was polite, always finishing her work on time. But there was something else, something Neka only realized later. Her husband, Chuka, despised her from the start. Or at least, that's what Neka thought. Chuka made a big show of scolding Mary for the smallest mistakes. Chuka claimed to despise Mary, always nitpicking and finding fault in her work. He always looked for reasons to complain about her presence. "Why did you bring this one into our house?" he would grumble. At first, Neka thought he was being overly critical. Chuka's hatred seemed personal, almost too sharp to make sense. Then one day, Chuka announced he was traveling abroad to a hustle. Neka didn't think much of it. He had been talking about finding greener pastures for years. Chuka was gone for nearly a year. He called often enough, though his updates were vague. He claimed he was working odd jobs and saving money to send back home. But in reality, Chuka wasn't working at all. While Neka was taking care of her pregnancy, juggling her business and the housework, Chuka had fallen in with some shady friends abroad. They introduced him to a ritualist who promised him wealth if he could bring the right offering. The ritualist's demand? A virgin womb. This was where Mary came in. Chuka returned unexpectedly. Neka thought it was a surprise visit, but Chuka had other plans. He convinced Mary to meet him privately. At first, Mary refused, but Chuka promised her the world. He told her he will marry her and take her to abroad as his wife. "You'll have a better life than working as a housemaid," he told her. Mary eventually agreed, but she knew Neka wouldn't approve. So she lied, claiming she needed to visit her family in the village. Neka, trusting as ever, gave her permission and even handed her some extra money for the trip. Chuka's mother, Mama, happened to visit. She found it odd that Mary was packing her belongings at the same time Chuka was loading his bags into the car, saying he was traveling for business. Watching them exchange uneasy glances, Mama's instincts flared. "Why is Mary leaving on the same day as your trip?" she asked Chuka pointedly. He brushed it off with a nervous laugh, claiming it was just a coincidence. But Mama wasn't convinced. She pulled Neka aside and whispered, "Something isn't right here. Watch your husband carefully." Though Neka shrugged it off at the time. Mary never went to the village. Chuka drove Mary to a remote location where the ritualist waited. Chuka got his offering, and Mary's life was destroyed. After the ritual, Chuka rented a small apartment for her, far away from their home. He convinced her that he was doing it for her safety, telling her that his wife, Neka, wouldn't understand their arrangement. He filled the wardrobe with expensive clothes, lined the shelves with shiny new handbags, and placed the latest smartphone in her hands. Mary, still reeling from the horrifying ordeal, accepted it all quietly, unsure of what else to do. Chuka promised to visit her regularly and send money, urging her to keep their arrangement of traveling abroad a secret. Mary had to think fast when it came to explaining her sudden departure to Neka. She approached her one morning. "Auntie, I need to go back to the village," she said softly. When Neka asked why, Mary looked down, feigning embarrassment. "My mother is sick, and she needs me to help her." Concerned, Neka didn't question her father. She even gave Mary extra money for her trip. Mary smiled in gratitude, hiding the guilt that gnawed at her for lying to a woman who had only shown her kindness. Chuka suddenly became more generous, buying new clothes for their children and giving Neka a surprising amount of money to invest in her small business. He seemed to have turned over a new leaf. One evening, as they sat together, he casually mentioned he had been looking into properties for investment purposes. He claimed he wanted to secure a better future for their children. "The market is perfect right now," he said, his voice dripping with confidence. Neka was initially hesitant, given their limited finances, but Chuka reassured her. "I'll handle everything. You won't even need to lift a finger," he promised. What Neka didn't know was that Chuka was planning to use the house as his personal retreat, a place to escape his double life. When the house was ready, Chuka insisted on hosting a housewarming party, framing it as a way to celebrate their growing wealth. "It's for us," he said with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Neka went along with the plan, unaware of the deeper secrets her husband was hiding. She even invited friends and family. Little did she know that this housewarming would be the beginning of the end of their marriage. But cracks began to show during the housewarming party. While mingling with the guests, Neka overheard a conversation between Chuka and one of his friends, where they joked about Mary. The mention of the maid's name, coupled with their hushed laughter, planted a seed of doubt. Suspicion gnawed at her until she hired a private investigator to follow her husband Chuka. The investigator's findings were worse than Neka imagined. Chuka had rented an apartment for Mary and had been seen taking her shopping in upscale malls. He lavished her with gifts. Neka finally pieced together the story. Chuka hadn't just betrayed her. He had destroyed Mary's life. After the ritual sacrifice, he used his newfound wealth to keep Mary quiet while ensuring she couldn't track him down to his new house. Meanwhile, Neka confronted Chuka with the findings from the private investigator. She waited until the children were asleep and placed the investigator's report on the dining table. "Explain this," she demanded, her voice trembling with anger. At first, Chuka tried to deny everything, claiming the investigator was lying. But Neka pressed on, recounting the evidence. The visits to Mary's apartment, and the hushed conversations during the housewarming. Cornered, Chuka eventually broke down, admitting to his actions but attempting to justify them. "I did it for us," he said, his tone desperate. But Neka wasn't moved. "For us," she spat. "You've destroyed lives, including Mary's. And for what? Greed." Her words hung in the air. Heavy with finality, as Chuka realized the walls were closing in on him. Neka went to the address and found Mary there, gaunt and terrified. It took hours for her to confess, but when she did, Neka's world shattered. "I didn't want to do it," Mary sobbed. "He promised me everything. I didn't know." Neka reported everything to the authorities. Chuka was arrested the next morning during a business meeting at a local hotel. Mary, too, was questioned, but it was clear she had been manipulated and had no idea about the full extent of Chuka's actions. During the trial, the police traced the evidence back to the ritualist, who was also arrested along with Chuka's accomplices. "Neka told me she stays strong for her children. But every time I look at her, I see the shadow of what happened, the betrayal, the lies, and the lives destroyed for greed."